right, well, let's get started. Got a lot of people here who've joined us today, so I will start the webinar by saying welcome to everyone. I am Monica Brady-Myeroff, and we're going to be talking about how to teach and assess listening today. And I'm the founder and CEO of Listenwise, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Scott Petri, who is a Listenwise advocate and a 10th and 11th grade history teacher from LA County.
Yeah, I'm part of Los Angeles Unified. I teach at John F. Kennedy High School, which is in beautiful Granada Hills, kind of a suburb in the north part of Los Angeles.
Excellent. Sounds lovely. All right. So today in this webinar, we hope you'll learn about why listening is an engaging medium for learning. We're going to teach you some key instructional practices to using some of the features on Listenwise to assess listening, because this is new. The idea about being able to test your students' listening skills and give them the right level audio piece to practice on and assess where they are is new that we're going to talk about. And then some easy to use lesson ideas, takeaways for you to use right away in your classroom. So I'm going to kick it off by talking just about the importance of listening as an engaging medium to use in your classroom, no matter your grade level. So Listenwise is grades 2 through 12, but listening is something we all do. 80% of what we learn through listening. And we listen to the equivalent of a book a day. And by comparison, we speak about a book a week. And we love to listen to stories. And because it stimulates our brains, research shows that audio affects attention and memory. It requires more from your brain. You're making a movie in your mind as you're listening. And you're also processing the words as they're spoken. So it's more challenging. Listening has also been shown to build empathy among people who are listening to the same thing, as well as being able to put you into a situation, sort of in your shoes listening. That's what I call it. Another great reason why using listening is important. Visualization is central to good listening. And think about how powerful that can be for students who are coming from different perspectives and you want to help them take the perspective of somebody else. You can do that by playing a story that allows them to imagine what it's like in someone else's shoes. So I'm going to kick off the webinar by doing just that. I'm going to pop over to Listenwise and play you a story that is about about a refugee experience that was recreated in a museum. So we're just going to play the first minute or so of this story, and it's about trying to get your students to take another perspective. And you'll notice here on Listenwise the interactive transcript, the slowed audio, some of the other features we'll be talking about a little later.
Here's an effort to make you know what it feels like to walk in the shoes of a refugee. More than 65 million people around the world have been forced to leave their homes. The UN says they're fleeing violence, persecution, disasters. Doctors Without Borders hopes to show Americans what that life is like. They have a traveling exhibit they're taking to cities across the Northeast. NPR's Narit Eisenman joined the tour when it stopped in Washington, D.C.
Hi guys, how are you?
Our guide is Dr. Ahmed Abdelrazak, who normally works in a refugee camp in Tunisia. And he tells our little group to imagine that war has just broken out. We're going to have to leave our homes, our town. Then he takes us to this wall hung with plastic cards listing our most essential possessions. And he makes a startling announcement.
So what will I ask you guys? In 30 seconds, pick only 5 items.
In other words, we have 30 seconds to go through the cards and pick just 5 things to take with us. Abdelrazak holds up a stopwatch.
Okay, in 30 seconds, go.
There's a mad scramble for the cards.
5 items only.
Rita Keetzer, she's a 55-year-old homemaker, drove 2 hours from Virginia just for this tour. She looks preoccupied. Was it hard?
Yeah, I have a lot of choices.
10 seconds.
I had to really look it over.
2, 1, get off the time.
Abdelrazak inspects our picks.
What did you get here?
Cash, blankets, medicine. He notices no one brought shoes. Possible mistake. During the 1991 Persian Gulf War, when Abdelrazak was a kid, Saddam Hussein's government started bombing his town in southern Iraq. He and his family had to run.
So we walked and we walked. We walked for 10 days. 10 days non-stop. I remember I had flip-flop on my feet. On the 10th day, I had nothing on my feet.
I'm going to stop the story there because I think you get the feeling, you get the picture. And I'd love to hear what your reactions are, just throwing into the chat what you imagine seeing, how that makes you feel, and how hearing the voices of some people experiencing things can put you in a different position, quickly sort of drops the walls and takes you to another place. So you can chat about that while I go back to the presentation and share with you another reason why using listening is so powerful, and that is that good listeners are better readers. As students grow older, actually the relative importance of listening comprehension increases, because it takes until middle school to reach the point where reading comprehension outpaces listening comprehension. So one study shows that as students get older and problems emerge with their reading, providing an opportunity to learn content through listening, to learn vocabulary through listening, is very powerful, because students can understand texts that are at a higher level than they can read up until the middle school years. So the focusing on students' listening skills well beyond the learning to read grade ranges is important. And I mean, Scott can speak to that too. He's dealing with 11th and 12th graders, right? I mean, one of the reasons might be this next slide is about how it's important for career success. Number 2, listening skills. And this is one study from GMAT, but there are many studies that show how important listening is to skill building and, you know, to being a valuable job skill. Scott, is why do
I always like to point out at this point in the presentation that if my wife or my mother were around to hear me talking about listening skills, the laughter would be deafening. Typically not my forte, although as an educator, I've tried to get better at it as time has moved along. And really, I kind of learned about this the hard way, because I was really pushing speaking at my students. And then I realized that they, not only were they marginal speakers, but they weren't good at listening to each other at all. So I'm glad Listenwise came around and kind of changed the way I teach in my classroom.
Well, the other thing it can do is help with meaningful learning. And I like someone in the chat added that images are powerful. They really are. And we weren't looking at anything there, right? We were listening, but it was creating images in your mind. But it can also bring a level of access to voices and perspectives you haven't heard before, because listening, I believe, is a great equalizer. We're all listening to the same story, and with the supports on Listenwise, you don't have to lower the level of the audio. You just need to provide the right scaffoldings and support. So it's already easy to use, and that equity, it helps. So it helps to equalize the access to the text, and then the texts themselves reflect students' backgrounds and experience, and that creates meaningful learning. And then the data insight, that's what we want to talk about tonight a lot too, is just that formative assessments can help you measure student growth throughout the year. And there are some new ways that we partnered with Lexile to create a measure in listening. Actually, I think I'm going to pop over to the site again and just talk about that for a minute, because it's so important that when you're moving into the realm of assessing listening and assessing something, you have to have a benchmark as to how difficult something is. And just last year, we worked with Lexile to create this Lexile audio measure. And it is an indicator of the complexity of the audio passage. So this is measuring the audio, the way that the story is spoken, the vocabulary, the sentence structure, the pacing. It's built on a scientifically developed scale. Metametrics made it, the makers of the Lexile reading level. And now you can select the right Lexile audio level for your students and be able to meet their needs where they are. So every story has this level. And when you are in search, which I'm just going to carriage return to go into the advanced search, you can then search for low, medium, or high stories, as well as grade level stories. But again, if you're thinking about assessing listening and wanting to choose maybe a beginner story for some of your intermediate Ls that need practice on their listening, you can give them a low story with a quiz and assess data that way. So I just wanted to do that quickly to kind of set up the conversation that we're going to be having soon about listening strategies and choosing the right listening and setting up your students for success for that. So when it comes to learning goals, I mean, using listening can meet a variety of learning goals. I'm going to turn to you, Scott, to talk about what do you use it for? How do you incorporate listening in your learning goals?
So I've used Listenwise in a variety of ways over the year. At first, when I first fell in love with the program, I was using it twice a week. And what I realized is I was overwhelming my students with it. And then I polled my students to see at what times do they want to use it for homework? Do they want to use it for classwork? Do they want to use it to start discussions? And then this year with the pandemic and my shift to remote teaching, we have on Mondays, that's a support day. So I will find a Listenwise current event or a Listenwise weird news. And what I've used it for is I want to hear from every student every day. Since I don't usually see them, their cameras are off most of the times. And I feel like I'm teaching into the void. But with Listenwise, I usually take the discussion questions and then I pose one to each student that's just listened to a story, and I want to hear their reaction. Do they agree? Do they disagree? Did that make them happy? Did it make them sad? And it has been a very effective way for me to engage students on the support day where I'm not supposed to be throwing more work at them, and just engage them in a conversation and make sure that I can hear them. Everything's right in their world. They're not depressed. They don't need an intervention on my part. And it's really been fantastic. We all kind of look forward to Mondays, and you never know which event you're going to pick, and they're all short enough. Yesterday, because of the current event in Israel, we listened to a story on Gaza and Palestine. And the students all had questions about it because they've seen it on the news, they've heard about it. And it was, I think, a well-rounded and balanced story that allowed them to safely discuss it in class. So.
Well, you have just mentioned half of these learning goals on the slide. Part of it can just be SEL, check in how you're doing. We've got these great weird news features that are just fun and interesting. I'll demonstrate one later, but it doesn't all have to be engaged with the link to the content they're learning. But it is nice that it's connected to the world in some way and can promote engagement with the text and critical thinking about it. So those are some great ideas, Scott. Thank you. I want to talk for a minute about the types of listening, because when you're talking about teaching and assessing listening, I think you first have to step back and say to yourself and to your students, hey, this is a skill that you can improve, that there are things you can do to improve it, and that will help you across all academic areas. And it begins with helping them understand, too, that there are different types of listening. Listening is just not all the same, and they need to be engaging in different types as they progress through the day. So the three I'd focus on in the classroom setting are precise. You use this type of listening if you've ever asked for directions. Students need to listen to precisely to teachers to get instructions on a regular basis. Strategic listening is probably the most commonly used in learning because it's about comprehension of substantive material. Like, what is the main idea? Can you summarize what you've just heard? It allows the listener to summarize what has been heard, make inferences, and when strategically listening, learners should understand the importance of the main idea and be able to tell it back to you. And then critical listening is when you're evaluating a speaker's point of view, another really important skill to learn, both in reading and in listening. I think you're probably seeing themes emerge here that many of these skills that you're learning through listening, you're practicing through listening, are excellent for reading as well. So in critical listening, this can be hard because you've got to actively listen for a specific purpose, and you're using a higher order of thinking skills.
So, can you go back to that slide for 1 second? Because I want to loop in our friend Julian Treasure here, who says, think of all these different types of listening as like the mixing board. And you can tell your students, this time I want you to be listening critically. This time I want you to listen strategically for the main idea. This time I want you to listen precisely for details. And I always find if you can give your students a prompt or a purpose, then that engages them more, and they're less likely to pick this up and become multitasking while you're asking them to listening.
Great advice. And that actually dovetails right into talking about listening strategies. So these are some metacognitive strategies designed for listening to help improve listening. So now you've talked to your students about the types of listening. It's in their control to change. Well, how do you help them change it? One thing is to direct their attention. So start by sharing some strategies they could use while listening. Note taking is okay. Maybe you're able to shut the door, dim the lights. Like, what should they be doing while listening? Honestly, some kids don't know. They're like, what? I'm just supposed to listen and not look at my phone or do something. So having them that it's listening is a constantly evolving task, and they should be modifying their understanding of the story as it goes along. The next thing is planning. This is kind of what you touched on, Scott, is that what is the goal for listening? What are they going to be doing before, during, and after the listening? And this is not telling your students how to listen, but telling them to what ideas or details to listen for. So will they be critically listening for a particular point of view and maybe taking notes on that point of view? That helps as well. And then the problem solving is that letting them know that they're not going to understand every word that was said. Their mind will wander. All of us do. They'll need to problem solve as they do this. Listenwise has some good graphic organizers that you could use online or print out to help them make meaning and track it. But they should be able to guess the meaning of the words as they hear them. And
I'm sorry, I'm cutting you off, but I want to jump in because I'm so excited about this. This year, I had my students read an audiobook or listen to an audiobook called Patriots from the Barrio, which is about the only all Mexican-American U.S. troop that served in World War II. And I totally stole the format for your listening guides, and I created one for each chapter. And then because the chapters were about maybe 10 minutes long, I would let it play for about 3 minutes, and then I'd stop and I'd recap and I'd say, Monica, what did you write down for number 1? And, Scott, what did you write down for number 2? And the class would come to a consensus through conversation. Well, I heard this. Well, I heard that. And I'd make sure I'd just kind of pause there and make sure that everybody was engaged with the organizer so that after we were done with the chapter, they could use the information in the organizer to write a summary or do something else with it. And I want to add on to that is another big piece that I learned when I was using Listenwise for the first time in the face-to-face situation is I would kind of sit in the back row of my class and I would watch them. And as soon as I said, you're all going to listen to something, and as soon as I pressed play, I'd see half of my kids get out their phones and they just start scrolling through. And just the attitude of prompting them. And before we listen, I say to them, look, we're going to listen to this. It's 7 minutes long. It's 5 minutes long. You're going to put your phone on do not disturb. You're going to put your phone down. Your friends will still like you. You'll still get likes on your posts. You don't have to check them now. I want you to put 100% of your attention into what you're listening to. And just adding that little pep talk at the beginning totally boosted the scores on their quizzes.
that's amazing. It really is, a lot of it is awareness.
And it's hard to remember, but you still have to do it. Even 3-4 years later, I still have to remind them. And especially now that we're remote, I have to say, make sure you put your phones down, close your other screens. If you're wearing headphones, that's good. If you're not, don't have headphones, shut the door. Because a lot of my kids are in loud houses, and it's hard for them to follow a longer podcast.
Yeah. Well, that's a great introduction to talking about tracking data for formative assessments, because one of the things you want to help your students do is see their improvements, right? And see that they can become better listeners. And I know that, Scott, you've been tracking this for a while and using these Listenwise quizzes. I'd like to ask you, why do you think it's important to track listening?
So, well, for me, my biggest point is I want my students to sense some sort of ownership over this skill, and I want to show them growth over time. And when I do the first couple of quizzes, sometimes I don't give them that many supports and the scores are really low. And over time, what I've realized is my students get better And all of a sudden, like I would say after maybe 6 or 8 Listenwise stories, I have most of my class is scoring 80% and 100% consistently. So I often go back to that data and show them, look, on your first one, you only got a 40%. But over time, because you've gotten better, you've practiced, you've paid more attention. And a lot of times what I do is I look at what are their weaknesses. Is it in finding the main idea? Is it in finding evidence? And when I just draw their attention to that weakness, I say, you seem to be having trouble in this area. What do you think you could do to change that? All of a sudden, it's just creating more engagement and more effort into the listening process. So the quizzes are good because they're snapshots over time where you can show your students making progress. And I'll tell you, the other thing I love is the timestamp, because now I know a student spent 2 minutes on a 5-minute podcast, or a student spent 15 minutes on a 5-minute podcast. And are there differences in their scores? You bet there are.
Yeah.
And that has been a nice feature to really share with the students and get them to reflect about.
Great. We'll show some of that in a moment. To just sort of explain the quizzes, that they are on most of the stories in our lesson collection, and we add a new one every week in the current events. And the quizzes are tracking 8 different key skills of listening, and they always address the 4 main skills, which is identifying main idea, recognizing literal meaning, making inferences, and understanding vocabulary. So there will always be those 4 main things. That's often what's tested on the SBAC test if you're in an SBAC state like Scott is in California. And this slide shows you how you can find the quizzes on Listenwise, always making sure you check the box, the lessons with quiz. But they are simple, they're super easy to assign. And as Scott was saying, when you assign a quiz, you're given the option of whether or not to include the transcripts. And what I understand, many teachers, I think you as well, would sometimes start out with the transcripts and the quiz. As students are learning how to process this information auditorially, they also want to watch the transcript and then slowly practice without the transcript as they improve over time. So this is just a sample view of one of the questions on the quiz. This is an example of a critical listening main idea. So the students will be listening critically or strategically, really, to figure out what is the main idea. And the students' performance will inform your instruction, as Scott said. Here is a snapshot of some of Scott's information, students, how they've been doing over time. Do you want to talk to this, Scott?
So yeah, like I can see that my class average is 83%. So I would scan down this list and I'd look for who are the kids who are doing less than that and who are the kids who are doing more than that. And then what I really like about Listenwise is how it tracks this over time. I forget if I've done 8 or 10 quizzes at this point, but you can see it totals up all the questions. And so overall, students are getting 87% of the literal questions. And what I can do is I can look down and see that, wow, Oscar's not coming close to that, right? Oscar's down at 71%. So I might ask Oscar to think about what does the literal meaning of this? Can you think about this more often? And the same with Destiny, who seems to be struggling with the main idea, and Rocio, who is struggling with vocabulary, and Layla, who is struggling with inference. After a while, this just kind of jumps out at you. And I say, all right, so what type of questions did we do well on? What type of questions did we not do well on? And the other thing that fascinates me is often when I scroll through an individual quiz and I look at, okay, why did everybody get this wrong? Everybody has marked the same distractor. So everybody has guessed, their second guess was probably the right answer. And I wish I could track that, because if they said, well, if you had a do-over, what would you pick if now you know that's the wrong answer? I think they'd do much better. But
well, you can now give them a do-over. There is a way to reset the quiz. I mean, that's and when the quiz finishes, what's great too is the students also see how well they did on each question and answer. They get the correct answer if they got it wrong, and they're told their overall score. Do your students, how do they process that when they see that? Do they like that, knowing right away how they did?
Yes, they do. They love immediate feedback. And then usually what happens is I'll revisit it in class where I'll talk about the results and I'll let them know like the most frequently missed question, and we'll kind of speculate like, why do you think most of the class missed this? Why was this a tricky question? And again, that's like a metacognitive skill that students, we call this exam wrappers sometimes, where you wrap up the exam and you kind of reflect on your performance. And sometimes kids say, oh, well, I wasn't really listening that well. My mom was yelling at me in the other room. And they might have an excuse for it. But over time, numbers don't lie. And if in 10 more quizzes, Layla's still only in the 40% when it comes to inference, that's a skill that I have to work on more with her. And so one of the things that has really challenged me as a teacher, as a social studies teacher, is how do I start making little lessons about inference work with my social studies content? How do I start making identify the point of view of focus of the instruction or a focus of the reading? And so the Listenwise Coaches Guide, Literacy Coaches Guide, which I know you'll talk about later, is of great help with me because it gives me some examples of how to bring that focus out in a lesson.
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna I'm gonna email a link to that literacy coaches guide because I realized I didn't include it in there. It is
Okay.
true that does help you understand how to better teach the skills. It's not those types of lessons are not integrated on our platform at the moment. It's something we're working toward doing. But the literacy coaches toolkit, which is available for free on our website, does help.
So we have a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah, I can't see the chat. Can you see it?
Okay, yeah, I can see it. So Elizabeth asks, are these listening podcasts only in English or accessible in other languages?
The audio is only in English. When a student is assigned a listening activity, there is a text help toolbar, which allows words to be individually read in Spanish or defined in English, Spanish, or picture dictionaries. So that does help with spot check, but though it's not a dual language platform.
Not yet, right?
Not yet. We are absolutely investigating that, especially with Spanish. I think it'd be really helpful.
So, and then Elizabeth has a second question. What are the costs to use this as a tool? I'd like to recommend it to my school principal. Boy, is she talking to the right person. You've got the person at the top. You got to make her an offer and sweet talk her. See if you can get some sort of discount. But I know there's a premium, like a 30-day free premium trial.
That's the first thing you should do, Elizabeth, is get on a free trial, but make it a school trial. Bring in 2 or 3 other teachers from your school. That unlocks 60 days of premium, which should take you through the end of the year, no problem. And then the pricing is based on the enrollment of your school. So it is a tiered pricing based on enrollment. So we'll follow up with you on that.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth.
I moved to the next slide where you have the student report individually. And this report now has that time spent listening, which you said you really liked. We just added this feature in the last 6 months, and it is really interesting to see, right? One of the students here only spent 4 minutes and 58 seconds on it.
And that's what I think is the most interesting thing here. You call the student's attention to that and say, well, you only spent 5 minutes on it. How well do you think you did? You can see she only got 40% of them right. Whereas if you look at the top on the California apologizes for the deportation of Mexican Americans, she spent almost 20 minutes and she got 80% right. So Magna Carta 16 minutes, 100% right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and it is kind of interesting to look at the Lexile levels there, but I think that's probably too geeky. And really, I'm looking at what's the correlation between the time spent on task and their results. Because if I see that a kid is spending 20 minutes and then they're still missing every question, I want to ask what's going on there, because you have the transcript, you have all these scaffolds, and if you're not using them to look for the correct answers, what's the problem?
Yeah, it could just be a matter of attention as well, right? I mean, this World War II Spy Gets Her Moment in the Sun is a lower Lexile level, should have been easier. However, we don't have the, I don't know how long that story was. You can't see it right here. If we were live, you could click on that and just go straight to it. So that would be one way to look
And
at
I
it.
just want to say one thing about that story. It's about Virginia Hall, who was an American who went over to England in World War II and became a spy. And this totally fit right in and supported this thing I did where my students had to write children's books on women in World War II.
Oh,
And the first day of instruction, I asked them how many, we had over 500,000 women in World War II. Some of them were pilots, some of them were spies, some of them were snipers, some of them were code breakers. Today, I want you to tell me about one of them. And they all wrote like, I don't know any women in World War II. I've never heard of a woman in World War II. And by the end of 2 weeks, I had 65 individual children's books on all these various women in World War II, including Virginia Hall, who was featured in that segment.
that's fantastic. Scott, this is another slide you shared with me and looking for patterns in the data, and explain how you shared this with the students to get them to really think about the metacognitive strategies they're using to listen.
Yes. So there's two things at play here that educational researchers talk about. The first is task initiation, which is, do the students do things as soon as they're assigned, or do they wait till the last possible minute? Also known as the time-honored adult and teenager act of procrastination. And then the second thing that is featured is what's called the spacing effect. And what happens, especially with listening, is once you've listened to something, like I listened to that story on Virginia Hall, and now I'm cognizant of the fact that, wow, women served in World War II. And I can think, I wonder if there were any other women. And then all of a sudden I see a Netflix documentary on Ludmila Perchenko, who was like a Soviet sniper that shot 302 people. She had like the highest number of kills of anybody in the Soviet Union. And then all of a sudden, as I'm aware of these two spectacular women doing wonderful things in World War II, I start thinking, why don't I know more stories about women in World War II? And all of a sudden, then it's like whoosh, 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 whoosh. They keep flying at me, and I see them in the newspaper, I see them on the TV news, I see a commercial for a movie coming out. So that's what's called the spacing effect. And so, like, once you're aware of something, your brain actively kind of connects other things to it. And it only does that over time. If you're rushed and you're cramming at the last minute, you've deprived your brain of that opportunity to do that. So I've tried to build this in as a reflection, and this is from a unit we did. And I gave them 6 stories that they had to do over 2 weeks. And then I sat back and I measured how many students did like one every other day and how many students waited until the last possible minute. And so I don't want to be the bad guy who yells at them for doing that. So I just asked them to reflect on that and look at their own data and find out what type of grade they would give themselves. And here's where you learn that your students are much harder on themselves than you will ever be as their teacher. And for all the students who waited until the last possible minute, they were just like, oh, I'm a loser. I stink at this. I rushed through it. I didn't learn anything. And what happens is over time, they're able to connect more schema to what they're learning about from these Listenwise stories. So
That's a
the
great
spacing
example.
effect and task initiation, if you've
Yeah.
learned 2 things from the webinar.
Well, I see student B had the problem with both of those.
Yeah, well, all of us do, actually.
All of us do. That's true. I just want to talk another minute about this Lexile framework for listening, because it's so important to be able to measure your students' progress. Now, as I said, we have an audio measure that's measuring the complexity of the story, and we're working on creating a measure of the students, and they will be on the same scale. So we hope to have for you this ability to put the student on the scale, similar to the way you would with reading. And because Metametrics has developed the audio scale on the same reading scale, we hope to be able to also further connect reading and listening. There are multiple studies that show better listeners are better readers, and that listening is very connected to reading. I mean, obviously, if the simple view of reading shows that reading is a product of decoding and language comprehension, which is listening comprehension in part. Anyway, exciting things happening there, and we hope to even refine that tool further. But let's move on now to some easy to use lesson ideas, takeaways that you can use in your classroom tomorrow. One of my favorites is the weird news feature. This is something that is, as I said, most of our collection is 5 to 7 minutes long audio stories. These are 30 seconds, but boy, do they pack a punch in vocabulary and also just in storytelling. So I'm going to go to this one and just play it because it's so much fun. Dog travels. Let's see if that brings it up easily. Just to give you a sense of what this is like and how easy it is to quickly assign. All of these weird news had the 2 vocabulary words pulled out. But if you noticed on the slide, I had several other vocabulary words in this 30-second story. Familiar, traveled, recently, reunited, current. They're all in this story. So let's have a quick listen.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Martin. Sometimes all you want is a familiar front porch. Maybe that's what was going through the mind of a yellow lab named Cleo when she traveled 60 miles to her family's old house in Lawson, Missouri. They moved out in 2018. The new residents recently came home to find Cleo lounging on the porch. She's since been reunited with her family at their current address. No one knows how she traveled those 60 miles, but it must be a really great front porch.
So something the kids will like and enjoy. And then the questions use those vocabulary words in it. Why were the residents of the dog's old house surprised to find her lounging on their porch? Just a great way to lead discussions. Scott, I want to turn to you and ask how you've been, I know you said you used Hiroshima and the Legacy of Doubt recently in the Japanese internment. What are some easy ways you would suggest, or that maybe just telling us how you use those can help teachers understand what they can do with the platform?
Yeah, so I like to, instead of writing a research paper, I like to do what I now call the first person podcast. So I will play something like the Hiroshima podcast so that they have an example. They have essentially a mentor text of what a good sounding podcast sounds like. And then I'll give them topics that they have to then go and research, and then they have to record a podcast on that topic. And I'll tell you, one of my tricks is for every person they add to their group, they have to talk a minute longer. So if they want to do a podcast of like with 4 of their best friends, now all of a sudden they have to do a 6-minute podcast, right? And that's a lot of talking. That's a lot of research and a lot of time. And part of the theory behind this is that you want students to engage in the academic vocabulary. You want them to learn through inquiry. But you also want it to be social and fun. And a lot of times when they're recording something together and they have to make up even if they found the story from the internet, now they have to do the literary heavy lifting of putting it into the first person and saying, I, me, instead of just reading it as if it were regular copy. So they still have that challenge of the theater of the mind. So you have to put yourself at Hiroshima. You have to tell me what it was like to survive the bomb. And this is just another way to trick them into reading. I like to use a lot of books in my history class. The Hiroshima by John Hersey is one of them. And what I like about this podcast too is it really illustrates quite well how attitudes about history change over time, and how at the time when we dropped the bomb, we were like, yeah, America, go America. And then over time, now we're like, ooh, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. So it teaches that, but more importantly, I think you got to get students creating, you got to get students demonstrating that they understand the historical topic under study. And so I love doing the first person podcasts and hearing their voices. And I will say in the post, there's a way to get free sound effects from the BBC.
And that's cool.
There's also a contest that NPR has every year called the Student Podcast Contest. And the one of the rules of that is no bumper music. They're not allowed to have any music, but they can have sound effects.
They just announced the winners for this year on Monday. It was a middle school class from Lexington, Kentucky. Reason I remember that is that's where I'm from originally. And they did a really touching podcast on all the custodial workers in the school and what they do, sort of the unsung heroes of the custodian staff. But that is a great example, Scott, about how to use listening is to help them create listening as well. Another thing I'd suggest is if you're flipping the classroom or you're still hybrid, asking students to listen to the story on their own and then take a quiz. And that's where you can use the feedback that we showed you to understand who needs help where. But then when you get into the classroom, you can have still a lively conversation, whether they've listened to it individually or together. Again, what I really like about listening, what excites me about it is that it is all the same story with the right supports for the students, the same level of vocabulary. Whereas many reading programs will level down the reading and you'll all be reading about Hiroshima, right? And maybe, questioning whether we did the right thing and how people feel about it, but the actual vocabulary and the sentence structure will be leveled for the appropriateness of the student. When you're listening, and especially when you're practicing listening, these are the kinds that you should all be able to listen to the same thing. Do you find that with your students too, Scott, with your ELs that might be struggling in reading, but they're okay with listening?
So yeah, I mean, and I always cite one of your kernels of research there that students can listen 2 grade levels higher than they can read, because when you're listening, you're hearing it pronounced correctly, you're hearing it in a proper sentence where you can pick up context clues. And what I found is that the students who listen to these podcasts, they're more confident in using that language in their own language. They're able to pronounce the academic language because they've heard it pronounced correctly by a broadcasting professional, which they don't get to hear when they're just talking to their friends about, Snapchat and Instagram and all that.
That's a great point. And actually that statistic about being able to listen 2 to 3 grade levels higher goes all the way through middle school. It does start to cross back over in high school, but if you're a teacher of 7th, 8th, 9th graders, you still have a huge amount of opportunity here to help your students learn through listening. Then the other thing I just suggest is maybe building some weekly routines. Scott, you talked about some Mondays are now maybe you're doing weird news every Monday. It is a great fun SEL type activity. On Wednesdays, we have a current event with a quiz. We are putting up new current events every single school day. And that you can sort of be driven by what's in the news and what kids want to talk about. And then on Fridays, we focus on a debate story. And that can prompt either a written response or an online discussion, live debate, however you'd like to do it. That brings us to the end. This has been so much fun talking about how to teach and assess listening. I'm happy to take any other questions, but just know that you can sign up for free for a free trial for your school for premium to get all these features. And Listenwise is free for teachers as well. There's a huge collection of audio with the ability to share the audio on a link and discussion questions. That's all free. So if you are, just trying to evaluate it, or you're want to start off with free and then check out premium, please do. Scott, any last words on?
So my last word is about choice boards. And I know we've talked about this before, but like when my district went last year to remote only, we had a rule. The students had to do 2 assignments per week, and that was it. And so I use Listenwise and a couple of other apps to give them choice. And then they just had to show me that, yeah, I did these 2 Listenwise, or I did these 2 Common Lits. And what I find as a history teacher is that Listenwise has a huge amount of content that covers my standards. So with a quick search, I can give my kids choice about listening to this for the Vietnam War, or this for the Korean War, or this for the Cold War. And they have a little bit more choice and then a little bit more agency in what they decide they want to learn.
Excellent. Love to end on that. Giving students choice is so important. And we have a very, very rich collection that allows you to do that. And the students can select anything they want to listen to and even assign their own quizzes to themselves, which you can then review. So I hope you've learned a lot about how to teach and assess listening today. And I really want to thank you, Scott, for joining me. And thank you all for spending some time with us and being such great listeners. Have a good evening.
Thank you.